When Dr. Evan Cole, a respected black heart surgeon, moves to a small town to help the community, he's met with hostility instead of gratitude. Officer Daniels, a corrupt and racist cop, relentlessly targets Evan, using intimidation and false accusations to undermine his reputation. As Evan uncovers a deeper web of systemic racism and corruption, the injustices grow more infuriating, highlighting the struggles black professionals face in spaces they are deemed unworthy of occupying. Despite the mounting pressure, Evan refuses to back down, exposing the ugly truths of prejudice in a small town that's desperate to silence him. The early morning light seeped through the cracks in the blinds, casting faint streaks of gold across the small office. Dr. Elijah Brooks sat behind a sturdy oak desk that had seen better days, its surface cluttered with papers, journals, and a well-worn leather notebook. His sharp eyes skimmed over a medical chart, a habit born from years of precision and focus. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the fluorescent light overhead and the rhythmic tapping of Elijah's pen against the desk. Tap, tap, pause, tap. This was his sanctuary. No luxury office in the city, no sleek glass skyscraper for a man whose name graced prestigious journals and hospital wings. Instead, Elijah had chosen this place, a small old clinic nestled in the heart of Maywood, a neglected neighborhood on the south edge of the city. To the outside world, it made no sense why one of the country's top cardiothoracic surgeons and philanthropists, a man who'd once turned down offers from private practices paying millions, would spend his mornings here. For Elijah, the answer was simple. Because this is where he was needed. The clinic wasn't glamorous, its paint chipped from years of humid summers and harsh winters, its waiting room furnished with mismatched chairs donated from nearby churches. Yet to the community, it was home, a refuge for people who didn't always get a fair shake, and Elijah was their cornerstone, the quiet force who refused to let the neighborhood fall apart. His phone buzzed softly on the desk, breaking his focus. He glanced at the screen, a text from his assistant. Dr. Brooks, remember, board meeting at 11. Don't forget your suit this time. Elijah allowed himself a small chuckle, leaning back in the worn leather chair. It was a gentle jab. Last month, he'd walked into the hospital boardroom wearing jeans and scuffed boots after a morning shift at the clinic. The sharp contrast between his attire and the crisp, tailored suits of the other directors had turned a few heads, but Elijah hadn't cared. Let them whisper, they always did. He stood and stretched, his 6'2" frame towering over the small desk. His salt and pepper hair, cut close, caught the sunlight briefly, highlighting the lines etched into his face. Lines earned not just from long surgeries, but from battles fought outside the operating room. Elijah was a man of contradictions, polished when needed, humble by choice, a quiet power that made people both respect and underestimate him. And today, like most days, people were going to do both. The diner was an unassuming relic of the 1970s, checkered floors, cracked vinyl booths, and walls yellowed by years of cigarette smoke long past. It sat at the corner of Elm and Harrison, where gentrification had yet to plant its flag outside. The faint drone of cars filtered through the glass as the city began to wake up. Inside, the smell of burnt coffee and greasy bacon lingered stubbornly in the air. Elijah pushed open the door, the bell above jingling faintly. Heads turned briefly as he entered, but no one lingered. To them, he was just another man in a plain jacket and worn jeans, carrying himself with the kind of confidence that didn't need to shout. He slid into a booth near the window, a spot he favored for its view of the street, of people hurrying to work, children trailing behind mothers, and the neighborhood that always seemed on the edge of something. A waitress appeared moments later, her pen poised over her notepad. "Morning, Doc," she said with a tired smile. Her name tag read, Carla, though Elijah already knew her well. She was a single mother of two, working double shifts to make ends meet. "Morning, Carla," Elijah replied warmly. "Just coffee today, Black." Carla scribbled the order, her gaze flicking briefly to the table, where a trio of men sat near the counter. Their voices just loud enough to carry. Elijah didn't turn his head, but he could hear them. "Told you it's a joke. Place like that won't last another month. Can't believe they let him set up there. Who's coming to that neighborhood for help? Hey, people got a dream, I guess." The words were carelessly cruel, punctuated by low laughter. Elijah's jaw tightened slightly, but his face remained calm. He'd heard this before, too many times to count. Whispers about his clinic, dismissals of the people it served, and murmurs that he, a successful black surgeon, had no business in places like this. When Carla returned with his coffee, her eyes darted nervously to the group. "Ignore them, Doc. They don't know what they're talking about." Elijah smiled faintly. "Don't worry, Carla. I've got thicker skin than that." She nodded, but he could see the embarrassment lingering in her face. Embarrassment for them, not for herself. It was a weight Elijah knew well, carried by people forced to prove themselves over and over, no matter how high they climbed. The bell chimed again as a new customer entered. Elijah glanced up and felt an odd, immediate tension ripple through the room. A man in his early 40s walked in, dressed sharply in a suit that screamed money. His hair was slicked back, his expression smug as he surveyed the diner like it was beneath him. Behind him trailed another man, shorter and stockier, wearing a leather jacket. The suited man stopped near the counter, speaking to the owner, an older man named Lou, who'd run the place for decades. The conversation started quiet, but quickly grew heated. "I'm telling you, Lou, you're sitting on prime real estate," the suited man said, his voice carrying now. "I can make you a generous offer today, cash. Name your price." Lou shook his head stubbornly. "Told you already, Vince, this diner ain't for sale." Vince's smile thinned, his tone hardening. "That's a shame, Lou. The city's changing, whether you like it or not. You're holding on to something that doesn't have a future." At that moment, the man in the leather jacket turned his gaze to Elijah, who sipped his coffee silently. For a beat, their eyes met. The man frowned slightly, like he was trying to place Elijah but couldn't. After all, in jeans and a worn jacket, Elijah didn't look like anyone special. Vince turned to leave, clearly irritated. "Think it over, Lou. I'll be back next week. Maybe you'll be smarter by then." As the bell jingled and the men left, the diner felt heavier somehow. The hum of conversation subdued. Carla muttered something under her breath, shaking her head as she wiped down the counter. Elijah glanced back at Lou, who stood frozen behind the register, his weathered face lined with worry. "They've been coming in every week now," Carla said softly, as she refilled Elijah's cup. "First it was polite offers, now it's, well, you heard them." Elijah stirred his coffee slowly, his gaze drifting to the window, where Vince and his lackey disappeared into a sleek black car parked at the curb. "I heard." Lou looked up, meeting Elijah's eyes for the first time that morning. "They're trying to squeeze us all out, Doc," he said, his voice hoarse. "Your clinic's next, you know that?" Elijah leaned back in the booth, his expression unreadable. Outside, the city bustled on, unaware of the quiet battles playing out on its fringes. "Let them try," Elijah replied quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd faced bigger storms and come out standing. This opening sets the tone by introducing Dr. Elijah Brooks, a humble yet powerful protagonist, deeply connected to his community. It establishes the setting, a neighborhood under pressure, and introduces subtle hints of systemic challenges through the diner scene and Vince's intimidation. The brewing conflict is clear, an external force pushing to erase what Elijah and the neighborhood have worked to preserve. The city hummed outside the diner. As Elijah stepped onto the cracked pavement, a faint chill clung to the morning air, and the exhaust from Vince's sleek black car still lingered as it disappeared down the road. Elijah let his eyes drift over the block. The corner store with its flickering neon sign, the laundromat that hadn't seen a renovation in years, and the diner's worn exterior that felt timeless. To an outsider, it was unremarkable, but to Elijah, it was a neighborhood alive with memories. He turned toward his clinic, just a block away, its green awning bright against the drab concrete. The windows, recently cleaned, displayed small flyers offering free blood pressure checks and consultations for uninsured patients. It wasn't much, but it was a beacon for those who had nowhere else to go. Elijah paused in front of the door, running his thumb across the small brass nameplate. Dr. Elijah Brooks, MD, simple humble. Just like him. Inside, the clinic was beginning to stir. Nurses in scrubs moved briskly, charts in hand, preparing for the day's first appointments. A teenage boy sat in the waiting area, legs bouncing nervously as his mother filled out paperwork. Elijah offered a nod of greeting as he shrugged off his jacket. and hung it behind the reception desk. "Morning, Dr. Brooks," Janine, his head nurse, called as she flipped through a clipboard. "Your first patient's ready, Mrs. Turner. She's got a follow-up about her heart meds." "Thanks, Janine. I'll head right in." He barely made it 3 steps before the door swung open again, and the steady shuffle of heavy boots echoed across the linoleum. 2 uniformed police officers entered, their hands resting casually on their utility belts. The larger of the 2, a thick-set man with a trimmed mustache, swept the room with narrowed eyes, like he was assessing a crime scene. "Can I help you, officers?" Elijah asked, keeping his tone polite and neutral. The taller cop glanced at his partner before addressing Elijah. "You the owner here?" Elijah nodded, straightening to his full height. "I am Dr. Elijah Brooks. This is my clinic. Is there a problem?" The shorter officer squinted at him, an edge of disbelief in his expression. "Doctor, huh?" He said it like the word tasted sour. "We got a complaint about suspicious activity around this building. You know anything about that?" Elijah's brow furrowed. "Suspicious activity? I'm not sure what you mean. This is a medical clinic. Patients come here for care." The mustached officer didn't look convinced. "We've been getting reports about loitering strange people hanging around." His tone made strange sound like a loaded word. "Neighbors say it looks unprofessional." "Unprofessional?" Elijah repeated, his voice low. He felt his temper stir but tamped it down, breathing deeply through his nose. "With respect, officers, this clinic serves people who don't always have anywhere else to go. Sometimes they wait outside before we open. That's not suspicious. It's need." The taller officer's gaze lingered on Elijah's plain clothes, his work boots, his unshaven jaw. A quiet judgment that spoke volumes. "You got ID on you, Doc?" Elijah's fists curled at his sides. He fought the urge to respond the way he wanted. Sharp, indignant, justified. Instead, he reached into his back pocket, producing his wallet and flipping to his hospital ID. It showed his name, his credentials, and his photo, taken just last year. The taller officer studied it for a moment longer than necessary, before handing it back with a begrudging nod. "Looks legit." Janine's voice rang out, sharp and annoyed. "Excuse me, but is there a reason you're harassing my boss? Because I've got patients waiting and we're busy here." Both officers glanced at her, but neither responded. With a curt grunt, the mustached cop turned toward the door. "We'll be watching this place," he said over his shoulder. "Make sure it stays respectable." The door closed behind them, leaving an icy silence in their wake. Elijah released the breath he'd been holding and turned toward Janine, who stood with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Respectable. The hell does that mean?" she muttered. "It means we're doing something right," Elijah replied quietly, though his jaw was still tight. "Let's not let them ruin the day." By mid-morning, Elijah had traded his boots and jacket for a sharp charcoal gray suit. The shift felt like armor. He stood in the sleek hospital boardroom, an expanse of glass and mahogany where every chair was filled by a face that looked nothing like his. "Dr. Brooks, you're late," said Chairman Holloway, a gray-haired man whose tone made Elijah's name sound like an inconvenience. "Apologies, Mr. Holloway, I had patients to see." "Well, let's get on with it," Holloway replied, his voice clipped. "We're discussing this quarter's finances, and frankly, we've noticed an issue with one of your programs. The community outreach clinic is draining funds. You're aware of this, I assume?" Elijah glanced around the room. The other board members looked at him expectantly, their gazes somewhere between indifference and judgment. "I'm aware of the costs," Elijah said evenly, "but the clinic saves lives. It provides care to people who wouldn't otherwise have access to it. Isn't that part of our mission as a hospital?" "It's part of your mission," a woman in a crisp navy suit chimed in. "But let's be honest, Dr. Brooks. The numbers don't justify the expense. We're hemorrhaging money on charity cases while other hospitals are turning profits." Elijah's fists clenched under the table. He could hear the unspoken words beneath her polished tone. Words about charity for the wrong kind of people, about their quiet bias toward neighborhoods like Maywood and the black and brown families who lived there. "This isn't just charity," Elijah replied firmly. "It's healthcare. You can't put a price tag on lives saved." "Everything has a price tag, Dr. Brooks," Holloway said coldly, "and we'll need to reassess your program's viability before next quarter." The meeting dragged on, with Elijah forced to defend himself and his clinic at every turn. By the time it ended, his composure remained intact, but the frustration sat heavy in his chest, like a stone. He was exhausted, not by his work, but by the fight. Elijah left the hospital feeling the weight of the morning pressing down on him. He returned to the clinic just after lunch to find two teenagers huddled near the entrance, whispering urgently. One of them, a boy no older than 15, clutched his arm, a makeshift bandage stained with blood wrapped around it. Elijah's heart sank. What happened? The boy hesitated, his eyes darting around nervously. It's nothing, man, just a scratch. Elijah crouched beside him, his voice calm. Let me see. Reluctantly, the boy unwrapped the bandage, revealing a deep gash. Elijah's trained eyes knew immediately it needed stitches. This isn't nothing you need care, come inside. The boy's friend tugged at his sleeve. We can't, Marcus. That cop's been watching, you don't want them asking questions. Elijah's expression darkened, his chest tight with anger. He glanced toward the far end of the block, where a patrol car sat idling, its engine rumbling like a silent threat. The officers inside didn't move, but their presence spoke volumes. Forget them, Elijah said firmly. You're safe here. He led Marcus into the clinic, ignoring the weight of the officer's stares. His blood boiled, but his hands remained steady as he stitched the wound with practiced precision. You're good at this, Marcus mumbled, as Elijah clipped the thread. It's my job, Elijah replied softly. And it's your right to get care when you need it. Marcus nodded, his gaze avoiding Elijah's. Thanks, Doc. As the boy left the clinic, Elijah watched him go, the patrol car's engine humming like a growl in the background. The pieces of the day collided in his mind. The diner's contemptuous laughter, the boardroom's dismissals, the patrol car's silent menace. Injustice felt like a constant presence, coiled and waiting to strike. The day felt longer than it should have. Elijah sat at his desk in the small clinic office, his shoulders sagging as he stared at the mess of paperwork before him. Outside, the clinic was quiet. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the only sound breaking the silence. Janine had already gone home for the evening, and the front door was locked, but Elijah lingered. He needed a moment to breathe. The events of the past few days clawed at the edges of his mind, the patrol car outside like a shadow, the boardroom's threats, and Marcus, the teenager who'd been too scared to step inside his clinic. Elijah's chest ached with frustration. How many more kids would bleed because they were afraid to ask for help? He rubbed a hand over his face, his fingers lingering on his brow when his phone buzzed, startling him. The screen flashed a number he didn't recognize. Reluctantly, he answered. Dr. Brooks. The voice on the other end was shaky and hushed. Doc, it's Marcus, I need help. Elijah sat up straight, his heart thudding in his chest. Marcus, what's wrong? Where are you? They came back, Marcus stammered. The cops stopped me and my cousin said we were trespassing. They're taking us downtown. My cousin tried to talk back, and the phone cut out. Elijah's blood ran cold. Marcus! Marcus! Silence. He was already out of his chair, his heart hammering in his chest. Without hesitation, Elijah grabbed his coat and keys, storming out of the clinic. The street outside was dark, the distant hum of the patrol car, long gone. Elijah didn't care. He wouldn't let this stand. The police station was everything Elijah had come to expect. Harsh fluorescent lights, whitewashed walls, and an air of condescension hanging in the stale air. He approached the front desk, his movements brisk but controlled. The officer sitting there barely glanced up, his gaze locked on a computer screen. I'm here to see Marcus, Elijah said, his voice steady. He's a minor, I need to know what he's being held for. The officer looked up, unimpressed. Name? Dr. Elijah Brooks. The man smirked, leaning back in his chair. Doctor, huh? You family? No, Elijah replied, his jaw tightening. I'm his doctor and I know his rights. The officer's smirk faltered slightly, but he shrugged. Sit tight, Doc. Someone'll come talk to you. Elijah stepped back, his fists curling at his sides. Sit tight. The words scraped against his patience like sandpaper. He glanced around the station, where a few officers huddled by the coffee pot, shooting him quick glances, before turning back to their quiet laughter. Minutes passed, dragging into half an hour. Finally, a tall, familiar figure emerged from a hallway in the back. Officer Daniels. The sight of Daniels made Elijah's skin prickle. Daniels was a walking stereotype: square jaw, crew cut, and the kind of smugness that came with unchecked authority. He sauntered toward Elijah with the kind of confidence that dared you to question it. "Dr. Brooks," Daniels said, his tone dripping with mock politeness. "What brings you here tonight?" Elijah squared his shoulders. "I'm here for Marcus. He's a patient of mine, and he called me from this station." "Where is he?" Daniels smirked, as if amused by Elijah's audacity. "Marcus and his cousin were causing trouble on private property. We brought them in for trespassing." "Trespassing?" Elijah's voice edged higher. "Where exactly were they trespassing?" Daniels shrugged, his smile widening. "A lot in Maywood looks like they didn't belong there. We were just doing our jobs." "Didn't belong there?" Elijah's fists curled tighter. "They're teenagers, Officer Daniels. Scaring kids for standing around is not doing your job. I want to see them." Daniels' expression hardened, his posture shifting ever so slightly. "I don't think you understand how this works, Doc. You don't get to march in here making demands." Elijah felt his temper flare hot in his chest, but he fought to keep his voice even. "Then help me understand, because from where I'm standing, this looks a lot like harassment." Daniel's eyes narrowed, and the air between them thickened. The officers near the desk went quiet, turning their heads toward the exchange. For a long moment, neither man spoke, the tension suffocating. Finally, Daniel smiled that cold, smug smile again. "I think you need to leave, Dr. Brooks, before you make this situation worse for those boys." Elijah's breath caught in his chest. Daniel's words landed like a slap. Worse. The insinuation wasn't lost on him. Leave, or they'll pay for it. Elijah's fingers twitched, rage simmering just beneath his calm exterior. He leaned closer, his voice low and deliberate. "You know as well as I do that this is wrong. I'm not leaving until I know they're safe." Daniels tilted his head, his smile gone. "Suit yourself." He turned toward the officers at the desk. "Take Dr. Brooks to holding. Looks like he wants to spend some time with his friends." The words hit Elijah like a gut punch. Two officers stepped forward, their hands hovering near their belts. "Sir, you need to come with us." Elijah's stomach dropped, but he held his ground. "This is absurd. I haven't done anything wrong." "Obstruction," Daniels replied casually, turning away. "Let's see how a night in holding changes your tune." The cell was as cold as Elijah imagined it would be. The walls were cement, the bench hard and unforgiving. The door clanged shut with a finality that made his teeth grind. He sat, his hands clasped tightly together as he leaned forward, trying to process the anger flooding through him. Daniel's smug face haunted him. The system he fought against every day, against the odds, was now suffocating him. From the far end of the hall, he heard Marcus's voice, small, scared, and muffled through the thick walls. Elijah clenched his fists tighter, his nails biting into his palms. This wasn't about him. It was about those kids. About every patient who walked into his clinic needing help. About every person who had been turned away, dismissed, or ignored because they didn't look respectable. He breathed deep, steadying his resolve. Back at the clinic, Janine had been waiting. When Elijah hadn't returned her texts or calls, she grew anxious. Checking the local police database wasn't her usual job, but the system spat out Elijah Brooks's name. Detained, pending investigation. Her hands shook as she slammed the phone down and grabbed her jacket. Hours passed. The cell was quiet when the faint sound of keys jangling echoed through the hall. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped into the dim light. It wasn't Daniels. It was Janine, her expression taut with fury. "Doc," she said sharply. "Get up, you're out." Elijah blinked, stunned. "What?" "Get up, Elijah, I made a call." Behind her, a different officer, one Elijah didn't recognize, waited with an apologetic look. "Your friend pulled a favor," the man said. "But they aren't happy." As Elijah stepped out of the cell, Janine grabbed his arm. Her voice was low but fierce. "This isn't over. Daniels messed with the wrong person. Now what are we going to do about it?" Elijah stopped in his tracks. The hallway stretched ahead, sterile and empty. The image of Marcus, scared and alone, burned in his mind. The system was stacked against them, but he wouldn't back down. He looked at Janine, his eyes sharp with purpose. "We fight back hard." Elijah stood in his clinic office, pacing the narrow space like a caged lion. The events of the previous night lingered like smoke. Officer Daniels, Marcus's terrified voice, and the cold steel of the holding cell. His ribs still ached from where he'd been shoved against the wall. But it was nothing compared to the storm raging inside him. Daniels had made one thing abundantly clear. This wasn't a single incident. It was systemic, calculated, and it wasn't going to stop. Janine watched him from across the desk, her face tight with concern. "You can't just let this go, Elijah. What they did to you and those boys." She broke off, frustration sharpening her words. "They think they can scare you into backing down." Elijah stopped, turning to face her. His voice was low but steady, like a calm before the tempest. "I'm not backing down. If Daniels and his people think intimidation will keep me quiet, they don't know who they're dealing with." Janine hesitated. "But..." "No buts." Elijah cut her off with a hard edge to his voice. "Marcus and his cousin are still sitting in holding because they looked suspicious. Meanwhile, Daniels walks around like he owns this city. If I don't fight this now, I'll be complicit in the same system that's bleeding this community dry." Janine exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "All right, Doc. So what's the plan?" Elijah grabbed his coat and headed for the door, his resolve unshakable. "We make noise, real noise." Elijah's plan began with the people he knew best, the families he'd treated for years, the kids he'd stitched up after playground accidents, the mothers he'd comforted when their health failed them. He called an emergency meeting at the local community center, a building as worn and weathered as its residents, but filled with more resilience than the city could understand. By evening, the center buzzed with quiet anger and nervous energy. People filled the room: store owners, teachers, single mothers clutching their children's hands. Elijah stood at the front, his posture strong, his voice clear and unflinching. "You all know what happened last night," he began, scanning the crowd. "But this isn't about me. This is about all of us, about Marcus, about the businesses being harassed, and about the families being pushed out of this neighborhood because they don't look like they belong." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Elijah continued, his voice rising with each word. "They think we'll stay quiet, that we'll take it lying down, but this is our community, our lives, and I don't care how much power they think they have. We're not going anywhere." An older woman in the crowd, Mrs. Jenkins, stood up, her frail frame belying the fire in her eyes. "What can we do, Doc? What's the next step?" Elijah nodded, his chest swelling with determination. "We show them we're not afraid tomorrow morning. We're going to the police station. Every single one of us will demand answers, will demand justice for Marcus and his cousin, and we'll make sure they hear us." The room erupted into applause and shouts of agreement. Janine caught Elijah's eye and gave him a nod of approval. The fight had begun. The next morning, Elijah stood outside the police station, flanked by dozens of community members. It wasn't a large crowd, maybe 50 people at most, but their voices carried enough power to make the officers inside take notice. Marcus's mother stood at his side, clutching a handwritten sign: "Justice for our children." Next to her, a group of teenagers, some of them former patients, held up posters demanding accountability. Elijah stepped forward, his voice echoing through a borrowed bullhorn. "We're here because we refuse to be silenced. We're here for Marcus, for his cousin, and for every family that's been harassed or pushed out of this city." The crowd roared in agreement. Inside the station, Elijah could see the shadows of officers watching through the tinted windows. A door opened, and Officer Daniels emerged, flanked by 2 other officers. His smug expression was gone, replaced by one of simmering anger as he approached Elijah. "This is a public disturbance," Daniels said, his voice low but menacing. "You need to take your people and leave." Elijah stepped closer, refusing to yield. "This is a peaceful demonstration, officer. We have a right to demand answers." Daniels's lip curled. "Answers? You've got the wrong idea about how this works, Dr. Brooks. These kids were trespassing, plain and simple." "They were targeted," Elijah shot back, his voice hardening. And we both know it. This isn't about the law, it's about control, about intimidation. Daniel's face flushed red, his mask of composure slipping. I suggest you watch your tone, Doc. You're playing a dangerous game. Elijah didn't flinch. The only dangerous game here is the one you're playing, officer, but I'm not afraid of you. Daniels leaned closer, his voice a venomous whisper. You will be. Suddenly, the sound of car doors slamming broke the tension. Elijah turned to see a row of news vans pulling up along the curb. Reporters stepped out, cameras hoisted onto their shoulders, microphones ready. Janine stood a few feet away, her phone in hand and a sly smile on her lips. Thought we could use an audience, she said. Daniels froze, his gaze darting to the cameras now recording the scene. He straightened, his expression darkening as he stepped back. You think this'll change anything? You're wasting your time. Elijah held Daniels' gaze, his voice unwavering. We'll see about that. The news coverage spread faster than Elijah had anticipated. By the afternoon, clips of the protest were running on local networks, accompanied by headlines like, Community demands justice for wrongfully detained teens, and Local doctor challenges police misconduct. Inside the clinic, Elijah watched the news with Janine, his jaw tight as Daniels' face appeared on screen. Officer Daniels declined to comment on the allegations, the reporter said. However, sources close to the department confirm an internal review is now underway. Janine smirked. He's sweating, Doc. Elijah shook his head. Not enough. Marcus and his cousin are still being held, and if Daniels feels cornered, he'll only get more dangerous. Janine's smile faded. So what now? Elijah leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. We dig deeper. Daniels isn't working alone. Someone's protecting him. Someone higher up. If we don't expose the system, nothing will change. That evening, as Elijah locked up the clinic, the street felt quieter than usual. Too quiet. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the dimly lit sidewalk before stepping toward his car. The weight of exhaustion tugged at his limbs, but his mind was sharp. He was halfway to the car when a low voice stopped him. Hey, Doc! Elijah turned to see a figure leaning against the wall of the clinic. The man was tall, his face obscured by the shadows, but the glint of a gold badge on his belt was unmistakable. Long day, huh? The man drawled, pushing off the wall and stepping closer. His face came into view, and Elijah's blood turned to ice. It was Daniels. What do you want? Elijah asked, his voice firm, despite the unease crawling up his spine. Daniels smiled, a cruel, humorless grin. You've been making a lot of noise. Doc, people are starting to notice important people. That's dangerous. Elijah met his gaze head on. I'm not afraid of you. Daniel's smile widened. Maybe you should be. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low murmur. You keep poking around, and someone's going to get hurt. Maybe that sweet little nurse of yours, or maybe one of those kids you care so much about. Elijah's fists clenched, his anger bubbling dangerously close to the surface. Get off my property. Daniels tilted his head, pretending to consider it before chuckling. Suit yourself, but don't say I didn't warn you. He turned and walked away, his boots echoing in the silence. Elijah stood frozen, his heart pounding, as Daniels disappeared into the night. Inside the clinic, Elijah locked the door and sank into his chair, his breaths coming hard and fast. Daniels' words echoed in his head like a war drum. Janine's voice broke through the quiet as she stepped into the room. Elijah, you okay? He looked up, his expression dark with resolve. No, but I know what I have to do. Janine frowned. What do you mean? Elijah leaned forward, his voice cold and sharp. Daniels crossed a line tonight. I'm done waiting for justice to come to us. It's time we take this fight straight to them. The rain came down in sheets as Elijah pulled his car to a stop outside the darkened warehouse on the city's edge. His windshield wipers fought against the deluge, but he could still make out the hulking, rusted structure ahead. It was Daniel's final chess move, a clandestine meeting meant to sweep everything under the rug. Elijah knew if he didn't act tonight, the truth would stay buried forever. His mind replayed Daniel's threat from the night before like a drumbeat. You keep poking around, and someone's going to get hurt. Elijah had spent too long being a passive observer. His friends, his patients, his people, deserved better. Daniels, and the system he represented, had relied on fear to keep people silent. But not this time. He reached into the passenger seat and picked up a slim manila folder. Inside was the evidence he and Janine had compiled over the last 24 hours, documents linking Daniels to illegal property deals, falsified reports, and harassment campaigns against minority business owners. It wasn't complete, but it was damning enough to make Daniels sweat. Elijah exhaled sharply and opened the car door. The wind roared, pushing the rain sideways as he walked toward the warehouse, his feet splashing through shallow puddles. Every step felt heavier than the last, but his resolve pushed him forward. The inside of the warehouse was vast and hollow, its steel bones creaking against the howling wind. In the center, under a single flickering bulb, a small group of men stood around a table littered with papers and crates of unmarked cash. At the head of it all stood Officer Daniels, his badge gleaming in the dull light. "Look who finally decided to show up," Daniels drawled, his voice carrying across the cavernous space. He leaned back against the table, arms crossed, as his cronies turned to face Elijah. Elijah stopped just short of the table, his gaze locked on Daniels. "You're done, Daniels? It's over." Daniels let out a low, mocking laugh. "Is that so, Doc? You come all the way out here just to tell me that I thought you were smarter than this?" Elijah's voice remained calm, but the anger simmering underneath sharpened each word. "I have enough evidence to expose you. Your harassment of the neighborhood, your deals with Harrington, the false reports you filed, it's all here." He held up the manila folder, its edges damp from the rain. Daniel's smile faltered for a split second before he pushed off the table, his boots echoing as he stepped closer. "Let me tell you something, Doc," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "People like you think you can outsmart the system. You think one little folder is going to make a difference. You don't know how deep this runs." Elijah tightened his grip on the folder. "I know enough. You've been terrorizing this community for years. The only thing you care about is lining your pockets and keeping people like me under your boot." Daniels sneered. "People like you. There it is, that righteous tone of yours. You're all the same, proud, defiant. Until someone like me reminds you how the world really works." Elijah's blood ran hot, but he didn't take the bait. "You don't scare me, Daniels, and you don't scare the people I'm fighting for." Daniel's face darkened, his mask of arrogance cracking. "Oh, I think I do." He motioned to one of the men near the table, a tall enforcer with a scar cutting across his jawline. "Take his little folder, let's see how much noise he makes without it." The enforcer stepped forward, cracking his knuckles as he moved. Elijah stood his ground, his pulse pounding in his ears. The man lunged for the folder, but Elijah sidestepped, using the man's momentum against him. With a sharp pivot, he slammed his elbow into the enforcer's ribs, sending him staggering backward. Daniels blinked, caught off guard. "Get him!" Another man rushed forward, but Elijah was ready. Years of medical practice had given him steady hands and quick reflexes. He ducked under a wide swing and struck upward, catching the attacker under the chin. The man crumpled to the floor with a groan. Daniels snarled. "You think you're tough, Doc? You're outnumbered." Elijah turned to face him, chest heaving, but gaze steady. "Maybe, but you're out of time." Suddenly, the sound of distant sirens cut through the storm, faint, but unmistakable. Daniel's eyes widened in disbelief. "What did you do?" Elijah held up a small device in his hand. A voice recorder, blinking red. "I made sure someone else was listening." Daniels's composure shattered. "You arrogant son of a—" He reached into his jacket and pulled out a pistol, pointing it squarely at Elijah. The room froze. Elijah's breath caught, but he didn't move. He stared Daniels down, refusing to show an ounce of fear. "You think you can take me down?" Daniels hissed, his hand shaking ever so slightly. "You're nothing. You're just another name on a report I'll file tomorrow." Elijah took a slow step forward, his voice steady and calm. "You can't kill the truth, Daniels. Even if you pull that trigger, this ends tonight. You're done." The sirens grew louder, flashing red and blue lights now visible through the cracked warehouse windows. Daniels' men exchanged nervous glances, their bravado melting away. "You're finished, Daniels," Elijah said, his voice like steel. One way or another. Daniel's gaze darted between Elijah, the blinking recorder in his hand, and the approaching police vehicles. For the first time, Elijah saw the fear in his eyes, the realization that his power was slipping through his fingers. "Drop the weapon, Daniels," a voice boomed from outside. The warehouse doors burst open, a flood of officers pouring in, their guns drawn. Daniels' men immediately raised their hands, surrendering one by one. Daniels stood frozen, the pistol still trembling in his hand. "Drop it!" a commanding officer shouted again. Daniels' chest heaved, his face twisted in rage and desperation. For a moment, it looked as though he might refuse, might pull the trigger just to spite Elijah, but then, with a furious growl, Daniels let the pistol clatter to the floor. Two officers rushed in, slamming him face down onto the cold concrete and snapping handcuffs around his wrists. As Daniels was hauled to his feet, he shot Elijah a look filled with venom. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice ragged. "You think you've won? You have no idea what you've started." Elijah didn't respond. He simply stared at Daniels, unblinking, as the man was dragged toward the waiting police cars. The storm outside seemed to quiet as the warehouse emptied, leaving Elijah standing alone in the flickering light. He let out a long, shaky breath, his body finally registering the toll of the night. The evidence was safe. Daniels was in custody. But as Elijah turned and looked at the scattered papers, the crates of cash, and the echoing emptiness of the warehouse, he knew this was only the beginning. The system Daniels served was far bigger than one corrupt cop. There were others who had enabled this, profited from it, and hidden behind closed doors while people like Marcus paid the price. Daniels was a crack in the wall, but Elijah knew the wall still stood. As he stepped back into the rain, his mind swirled with uncertainty. The truth was out there now, but would it be enough to tear down the whole rotten structure? The storm battered against his shoulders as he walked to his car, his thoughts heavy. This wasn't the end. It was only the start of something bigger. The city slept under a dark, starless sky. Streetlights flickered along the deserted roads, casting long shadows that seemed to move with intent. Elijah sat behind the wheel of his car, parked across from the Millbrook Police Precinct, Daniel's lair, as he'd started to call it in his mind. The evidence was ready. The stolen files, hidden bank transfers, and records of Daniel's orchestrated harassment against black-owned businesses in the community sat neatly in a folder beside him. Janine had insisted he wait for the press or the right legal channels to deliver the information safely. But Elijah knew better. Daniels was untouchable in the system. A man like him, shielded by bureaucracy and allies in high places, would manipulate the process before justice ever saw the light of day. To bring him down, Elijah had to force the issue, make it public, undeniable. With a deep breath, Elijah grabbed the folder and stepped into the cold night air. Inside the precinct, Officer Daniels was alone, perched in the nearly empty briefing room, a lit cigarette dangling lazily between his fingers. He stared at a whiteboard filled with tactical notes, crooked photos of properties in Millbrook, Elijah's clinic among them. The man took his time, reveling in his schemes. The door creaked open, and Daniels looked up, smirking when he saw Elijah walk in. The room was hazy with smoke, a sickly mix of cheap tobacco and stale coffee. "Well, well, Dr. Bennett," Daniels said with a slow drawl, leaning back in his chair as though he owned the place. "You're a brave man showing up here uninvited." Elijah stood tall, folder in hand. His calm, unwavering gaze met Daniels' sneering confidence. "I'm here to give you a choice, Daniels." Daniels arched an eyebrow, chuckling. "A choice from you?" He gestured around at the empty room. "You sure you're not lost, Doc?" Elijah ignored the bait and tossed the folder onto the table. It landed with a sharp slap, startling Daniels slightly. "It's over everything you've done. Every bribe, every false charge, every dirty deal. It's all in there. Names, dates, witnesses, enough to ruin you." Daniels picked up the folder, flipping it open. His smirk faded as he skimmed through the neatly organized records. Elijah could see his jaw twitch, the vein at his temple throbbing, but the officer's tone stayed clipped and cocky. It's trash," Daniels scoffed, tossing the folder back onto the table. "Nobody will believe this nonsense." Elijah stepped forward, his voice sharp. "The people will believe it. I've got copies sent to the local papers, the mayor's office, and a lawyer who's more than willing to take this to court." Daniel's smile faltered for the briefest moment before he leaned in, locking his icy gaze on Elijah. "You think you're smarter than me, don't you?" His voice dripped with venom. "You think this is some heroic stand? Look around you, Doc. This is my town. Men like me make the rules. Men like you follow them." "Not anymore," Elijah shot back, his voice steady despite the fire rising in his chest. "You've stolen enough from this community. You've bullied and destroyed businesses, pushed families out of their homes, all while lining your pockets, and you did it because you thought nobody would stop you. Well, here I am." Daniel slammed his fist on the table, the sound echoing in the empty room. "You don't get it, do you? You think people like you?" He gestured to Elijah with a wave of disgust. "Can win. This town doesn't want you. They don't want your clinics or your progress, they want men like me keeping things in order." Elijah stepped closer, his voice low but razor sharp. "Men like you are the reason nothing ever changes." Daniel stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'll bury you, Bennett. Your clinic, your name. Hell, I'll make sure you don't even exist in this town anymore. You think you can beat me because you've got a couple of pieces of paper? I've buried bigger threats than you." The officer pulled a pistol from his belt, leveling it at Elijah. "And maybe I'll bury this problem right now." The room went still. Elijah's pulse thundered in his ears, but he refused to back down. "You can't kill the truth, Daniels. Go ahead. Shoot me if it makes you feel powerful, but every bullet you fired in this town will come back to you." Daniel's hand shook slightly, the confidence in his eyes flickering. Elijah took a slow step forward, the gun following his every movement. "You're scared," Elijah said, his voice soft but deliberate. "You're scared because you know you're finished. You think this town belongs to you, but it doesn't. It belongs to the people you've hurt, the people who are finally ready to stand up." The door to the briefing room burst open, and Officer Mitchell rushed in, gun drawn and face pale with alarm. "Daniels, what the hell are you doing?" Daniels spun around, startled, the gun wavering in his hand. He's trespassing," Daniels shouted, his voice cracking. "He's threatening me." Mitchell's gaze darted to Elijah, who stood tall and calm, his hands raised in plain sight. Then he looked back at Daniels, his expression hardening. "Put the gun down, Daniels." He's lying. He's got nothing," Daniels barked, sweat beading on his forehead. Mitchell's jaw tightened. "I said put it down now." The weight of the moment settled like concrete. Daniels hesitated, his eyes darting between Elijah and Mitchell, realizing that the last of his power was slipping through his fingers. With a snarl, he tossed the gun onto the table, sending it skidding across the surface. Mitchell stepped forward, handcuffing Daniels with swift, practiced motions. "You're done, Daniels." Daniels fought weakly against Mitchell's grip, his voice a low, angry growl. "You'll regret this, Bennett. You'll see. I'm not the only one. There are others bigger than me." "Then we'll take them down too," Elijah said, his voice steady. "One by one." Mitchell led Daniels toward the hallway, his shouts echoing faintly as they disappeared from view. Elijah exhaled, for what felt like the first time in minutes. He looked at the folder still sitting on the table, its contents, the first crack in the foundation of a rotten empire. Elijah stepped outside, the cool night air biting at his skin. A few squad cars had gathered, red and blue lights flashing silently in the dark. Daniels was loaded into the back of one, his expression, one of seething hatred. Even through the rain-streaked windows, his glare burned into Elijah. Janine's car pulled up nearby. She stepped out, her coat flapping in the wind as she rushed to Elijah's side. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Elijah nodded, his face set with a quiet determination. "It's done." Janine glanced toward the squad car as it disappeared into the night. "And Daniels?" "Arrested," Elijah replied, though his voice carried little satisfaction. "But he was right about one thing." Janine frowned. "What?" "He's not the only one." Elijah turned to face her, his gaze heavy with the weight of what was to come. Daniels was just the start. "There's more rot in this town. Bigger names, deeper pockets. If we stop now, everything he's done will just get swept under the rug." Janine exhaled, brushing rain-soaked hair from her face. "So what do we do?" Elijah looked out into the darkened streets of Millbrook, his jaw set with resolve. "We keep fighting!" The storm raged on, the winds howling like ghosts over the rooftops. Elijah stood still, the folder clutched tightly in his hand. Daniels was gone, but the war wasn't over, and he was ready. The next morning, Millbrook woke up to news that shook the town to its core. The Millbrook Daily ran with the headline, "Corruption Exposed. Officer Daniels Arrested in Connection to Systemic Targeting of Black Businesses." Accompanying the headline was a stark photo of Daniels, cuffed and being led into a squad car. His once smug demeanor was replaced by a grimace of defeat. News outlets from surrounding counties picked up the story, dragging Millbrook's dirty secret into the light. At Elijah's clinic, the waiting room bustled with patients, neighbors, and reporters looking for a statement. The small clinic that Daniels had tried to crush now buzzed like a hive, filled with people who had always been its foundation. Elijah sat in his office, Janine at his side, a weary but satisfied look on his face. His ribs still ached, the bruises from his confrontation with Daniels lingering like faint shadows, but his resolve was stronger than ever. Outside his door, he could hear people talking in hushed but hopeful tones. "Doc Bennett really did it. They're finally listening to us. He fought for us." The words warmed Elijah's heart, but he knew this was only a small victory. A battle won, but not the war. He turned to Janine, who sat across from him, nursing a coffee and scrolling through her phone. "Daniels is just the tip of the iceberg," Elijah said softly, his voice calm but resolute. "We both know that." Janine sighed and looked up. "I know, but you've started something, Elijah. This isn't just about Daniels anymore. This is about holding everyone accountable. People are watching now." She handed him her phone, where a video was playing. It showed footage from the precinct, where a group of young activists and business owners gathered the night before, holding signs outside the station. "No justice, no peace. Protect our businesses." Elijah watched the video for a long moment, a faint smile playing at the corner of his lips. "They're not scared anymore." "No," Janine replied. "And they're looking to you, Elijah. You're the one who stood up when no one else did." As the investigation into Daniels expanded, more came to light. His ties to shady property developers were undeniable, and further evidence revealed he'd been falsifying reports for years, harassing, intimidating, and arresting black business owners to force them into selling their properties at a fraction of their worth. Testimonies flooded in. People who had once been too afraid to speak found their voices. Maria Alvarez, the detective who had helped Elijah, spearheaded the investigation with renewed purpose, rooting out other officers who had been complicit in Daniels' schemes. Daniels, stripped of his badge and dignity, faced charges of conspiracy, extortion, and obstruction of justice. The courtroom was packed the day he was arraigned, his fall from power complete. Elijah didn't attend. He had no interest in seeing Daniel's shame. Instead, he spent that day at the clinic, working with his patients, doing what he did best, serving his community. For Elijah, the fight wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. And justice, in its truest form, meant healing what had been broken. The news of Daniel's corruption sent shockwaves through Millbrook, exposing cracks that had been papered over for years. Local officials scrambled to respond, publicly denouncing Daniels while quietly trying to distance themselves from the mess. The mayor announced a sweeping review of the police department's practices, promising reforms that had long been overdue. More importantly, the community began to see itself differently. Business owners who had lived in fear of harassment banded together, creating an alliance to support and protect one another. The community center, once a target, became a hub for organizing efforts, hosting town halls and workshops to educate residents about their rights. Elijah found himself at the center of it all, though he never sought the spotlight. He spoke at gatherings when asked, his voice calm and measured, encouraging people to stay united, to keep pushing for change. "This isn't about one man," he told a crowd outside the community center one evening, his words carrying in the warm night air. "It's about the system that let him thrive. We can't fix this overnight, but we can start today, together." The crowd erupted in cheers, and Elijah stepped back, humbled by the strength and resilience he saw in their faces. In the quiet moments, when the chaos had died down and the clinic fell still in the late hours, Elijah reflected on how far he'd come. He was no longer just the quiet doctor who kept his head down. He had found his voice, even in the face of unimaginable pressure. The confrontation with Daniels had tested him, his patience, his strength, and his resolve. It had forced him to confront his own doubts about whether one man could make a difference. But now, as he looked around at the community he loved, he saw proof that change had already begun. Janine noticed the shift in him too. "You seem different," she said one afternoon, as they reorganized medical supplies in the clinic. "Stronger, like you're ready for whatever's next." Elijah smiled faintly. "Maybe I am." She leaned against the counter, studying him. "You know they're going to keep coming to you, right? People with stories, problems, looking for help." "I know," Elijah said, meeting her gaze. "And I'll be here for them, for us." But even as Millbrook began to heal, Elijah knew the work wasn't done. Daniel's arrest was a victory, but whispers remained of others, developers, politicians, and businessmen, who had profited from the same corrupt systems. Vincent Harrington's name floated to the surface more than once, his property developments scattered across the very neighborhoods Daniels had targeted. Maria Alvarez visited the clinic one evening, a thick file in her hand. "I thought you'd want to see this," she said, dropping it on the counter. "It's about Harrington." Elijah frowned, flipping through the pages. It was a tangled web of property records, shell companies, and untraceable payments. "This goes deep," he muttered. Maria nodded. "Daniels was small-time compared to guys like Harrington, but his arrest shook them. They're scrambling, trying to cover their tracks. If we move now—" Elijah looked up, his expression firm. "Then we can stop them." Maria smiled, a glint of determination in her eyes. "That's what I like to hear." The following month, the clinic reopened with a fresh coat of paint, the broken windows replaced and reinforced. People came in droves, not just for medical care, but to see the man who had stood up for them when no one else would. The sign above the door now read, "Millbrook Community Health Center, a place for all." On the morning of the reopening, Elijah stood outside, watching as families and neighbors gathered. Janine joined him, nudging his shoulder. "Not bad for a humble doctor." Elijah chuckled, shaking his head. "Not bad at all." A group of young kids ran past, laughing and shouting. One of them stopped and looked up at Elijah. "Are you the guy who stopped the bad cop?" the boy asked, wide-eyed. Elijah knelt down, meeting the boy's gaze. "I didn't stop him alone, we all did it. Together." The boy nodded, as if satisfied with the answer, then ran to catch up with his friends. Elijah straightened, looking out at the bustling street, the sounds of life and hope filling the air. As the sun dipped low, casting Millbrook in golden light, Elijah stood on the steps of the clinic, watching as the town seemed to move with renewed purpose. He knew the challenges ahead would be steep. Daniels was gone, but others like him remained. People like Harrington were still out there, quietly pulling strings. But for the first time, Elijah didn't feel alone in the fight. The community had found its strength, and so had he. Janine joined him again, handing him a folder, another file of suspicious activity tied to Harrington's developments. "You ready for the next one?" she asked. Elijah took the folder, his jaw set with quiet determination. "Always." The two of them stood together, looking out over the town they were determined to save. The weeks that followed were a blur of change, both for Elijah Bennett and for Millbrook. The town, once teetering on the edge of despair, began to stir with life again, as though waking from a long, restless sleep. The headlines shifted away from violence and corruption to stories of renewal, of people standing up, reclaiming their streets, and demanding more. For Elijah, those moments were bittersweet. He'd spent so long just trying to keep his head down, quietly serving his patients and staying out of trouble. He hadn't asked to be the face of a movement, hadn't wanted to become a symbol of resilience, but as he walked through the streets of Millbrook, he realized that the community had needed someone to step forward, to remind them of their strength. And in some ways, he had needed it too. Elijah stood at the edge of the community center's playground one afternoon, watching children chase each other under the sun. Their laughter echoed across the lot, a sharp contrast to the tension that had gripped the neighborhood only weeks earlier. Parents watched from nearby benches, talking and smiling in ways they hadn't done in years. Janine approached, hands in her jacket pockets, and stood beside Elijah. They've got you to thank for this, you know, she said softly. Elijah shook his head. It's not just me, it's all of us. Everyone who spoke up. Everyone who fought back. She turned to look at him, studying his calm but determined face. But you were the first one in, Elijah. You showed us what's possible when you don't give up. Elijah let the words settle for a moment. He didn't see himself as a hero, just someone who had done what needed to be done. But there was no denying that the events had changed him. He had found a strength in himself he hadn't known existed, a quiet but unshakable resolve that would carry him forward. I used to think keeping my head down was the best way to survive, Elijah said, his voice reflective. But staying quiet doesn't stop the problem, it just lets it fester. Daniels was only part of something bigger, something that's been hurting people like us for generations. Janine nodded, her expression thoughtful. So what now? What's next for you? Elijah looked out at the playground again, where a little boy shouted triumphantly as he climbed to the top of the slide. Now I keep going, I keep doing the work, here, in the clinic, and out there, wherever it's needed. We can't fix everything overnight, but we can make progress, one step at a time. What happened to Elijah, to his clinic, and to his community, wasn't unique to Millbrook. Across the country, stories of systemic racism, abuse of power, and targeted oppression echoed like ripples in a pond. The events had been a brutal reminder of how deep these problems ran, how they thrived in silence and complacency. But Millbrook's fight had become a spark. A story that inspired others to look closer at their own neighborhoods, to ask hard questions, and to demand better. News outlets picked up the story, turning Elijah's quiet stand into something larger. National commentators spoke about the need for reform in small towns and cities, where systemic biases often went unchecked. Organizations reached out to offer resources to communities like Millbrook, helping them organize, rebuild, and reclaim what had been taken. Elijah's clinic, once a quiet corner of the neighborhood, became more than just a place for healing. It became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that change was possible when people refused to accept injustice. One evening, Elijah sat on the steps of his clinic, a hot cup of tea warming his hands. The air was cool, the sky streaked with the last remnants of sunset. He watched as neighbors walked by, waving and calling out greetings. Some were patients, some were strangers, who had come to know him only through the headlines. A young girl approached hesitantly, clutching a notebook to her chest. Elijah smiled softly. "Hey there, what can I do for you?" She shuffled nervously before speaking. "Are you the doctor who stopped the bad cop?" Elijah paused for a moment, then nodded. "I helped, yeah." The girl's eyes lit up, and she held out her notebook, flipping to a page where she'd drawn a picture of a man standing tall in front of a building. Around him were smaller people holding signs, their faces smiling. "That's you," she said proudly. "My teacher told us about you in class. She said you fought back so people wouldn't be scared anymore." Elijah's throat tightened as he looked at the drawing. It was simple, childlike, but it carried a weight that made his chest ache. "That's very kind of you," he said quietly. "Thank you for showing me." She grinned and ran back to her parents, who waved at Elijah as they continued down the street. He watched them go, his heart full. Elijah knew that Millbrook's story wasn't over. The arrest of Daniels and the exposure of corruption had been victories, but they were only the beginning. There were still powerful people like Harrington out there, quietly pulling strings to benefit themselves at the expense of communities like his. But now, Elijah and his neighbors were ready. They had seen what was possible when they stood together, when they spoke with one voice. Fear had no place in their streets anymore. At a town meeting held weeks later, Elijah stood before the crowd in the community center's gymnasium. The room was packed with families, business owners, and young people who had come to listen. "I'm not a politician," he began, his deep voice steady. "I'm not an activist. I'm a doctor. My job is to help people heal. But sometimes, healing means more than just treating a wound or fixing a broken bone. Sometimes, healing means fighting back against what's hurting us." The crowd listened intently, the room buzzing with energy. "What happened here in Millbrook wasn't new," Elijah continued. "It's happened in towns and cities across this country, but that doesn't mean we have to accept it. We are stronger than they think we are. And when we stand together, When we fight for each other, there's nothing they can take from us." The room erupted into applause, and Elijah stepped back, his heart full. He wasn't the same man he'd been when this all started. He was stronger. His community was stronger. And together, they would keep fighting. As Elijah walked home that night, the stars bright above him, he reflected on the road ahead. There would always be people like Daniel's, men who wielded power to hurt, rather than to help. There would always be challenges, injustices, and moments when the fight seemed too hard. But there would also always be people like Janine, like Maria, like the families of Millbrook, people who refused to give up, who found strength in each other. Elijah smiled softly as he reached his door, the light from the clinic glowing warmly behind him. The battle for Millbrook had been hard, but it had shown him a truth he'd carry forever. Change was possible, progress was real, and when people stood together, nothing could hold them down. He opened the door, stepping inside with the quiet certainty that tomorrow would be brighter. And no matter what came next, he was ready.